Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Blog Series. It is Wednesday, April 9th, 2025, and on Wednesdays we tackle emotional well-being and relationships. Today's topic, rule to be kind. Sounds like a song lyric, doesn't it? Well, I grew up believing that those of us who lived in the United States and Canada were kind people, and that in the main, we'd always try to do the right thing. Yes, we created problems certainly early on in the founding of these two great nations, especially in terms of Europeans' treatment of indigenous peoples and the slave trade. But eventually, we learned the error of our ways, and we struggled, especially across the 20th century, to correct our mistakes. By the time I was a child in the 1960s, we were in the business of passing civil rights legislation and actively touting equal rights and universal human rights for all people, no matter what their background, no matter what their station in life. So whatever might have been our flaws, and despite some ongoing prejudices, the main messages that I learned in school and in civic life and in church was that we were, at our core, a kind people. The meta-narrative in our songs and in our collective rituals was that we were a kind and even loving people, that we would share the wonderful wealth and abundance of our North American worlds, and that we'd respect the rights and the freedoms of people everywhere. I grew up believing that whatever our flaws, we would always try to be the good guys. We would help our neighbors and strangers alike. And while we all wanted to get ahead and to do well in our lives, at the same time, we believed in wanting the best for people everywhere, both in our own country and abroad. If we saw bad things happening or freedoms being stripped away, we'd step up, we'd be there. Again, we would try to do the right thing. So is that still true? Well, I think for most people, we are still kind and loving human beings. But let's start with you, if you don't mind. Are you a kind person? Are you an empathetic person? Do you care about people in general? Not just about yourself and your family, but more broadly. Probably yes. Almost certainly yes, especially if you're watching this vlog. And certainly, at least to some degree. On the other side of the equation, are you a person who lacks empathy for others? Or, in the extreme, are you a cruel person? I'd wager the odds are close to zero that you're a cruel person. Okay? But what does that even mean, to be cruel? Well, there's a clinical aspect. It's referred to as antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD, sometimes called sociopathy. So ASPD is a medical condition, a mental health condition, where a person consciously disregards right and wrong, displays a lack of conscience, ignores the rights and feelings of others, and much more. People with ASPD tend to purposely make others angry or upset them, and they'll manipulate or treat others harshly or with cruel indifference. They typically lack all remorse or ever regret their behaviors. So again, the chances are that you're not a sociopath, and yet such people clearly do exist. You might even know one or two yourselves, possibly in your own personal spheres. So how prevalent is ASPD? Well, from one study in the early 2000s, it's estimated that about 3% of the general population would meet the criteria for ASPD. The prevalence rates are 3 times higher for men compared to women. So now the Mayo Clinic cites several symptoms, if you will, or conditions associated with antisocial personality disorder. Or you can check out the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5, for a clinical description. What I've done is I've constructed a brief questionnaire that you can take for yourself, or you could complete on behalf of someone else if you choose. It's really quite simple. So basically, you just have to respond to each of the following statements by indicating your level of agreement or disagreement. Okay, so we would say, do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with the following statements? And there's 16 of them. So again, it could be yourself, or you could respond on behalf of someone else that you know, person X, regularly or frequently. Okay, so again, you're going to strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. I regularly or frequently ignore right and wrong when deciding what to do. Tell lies in order to take advantage of others. Tend to be sensitive toward or respectful of others. Use charm or wit to manipulate others for personal gain or pleasure. Again, I regularly or frequently feel terrible if I see other people suffering. Have a sense of superiority towards others. Feel a deep sense of guilt or responsibility if I hurt or harm others. Have problems with the law or engage in criminal behavior. Tend to be hostile, aggressive, or threatening toward others. Avoid dangerous things that would put other people at risk. Create conflict or cause chaos to gain advantages or benefits. Have to be in control at all times. Again, remember the statements always start with, I regularly or frequently tell the truth, no matter what the consequences. Feel no remorse if I harm others. Fail to fulfill work and/or financial responsibilities. And finally, I regularly or frequently try to be kind to people, no matter who they are. Okay, so again, you can score each of these and add up your sum totals. In fact, with the reverse scoring, I put it there, right? So the top, the columns are strongly agree, SA, agree, disagree, D, strongly disagree, SD. And the scorings either go from 3 to 0 or 0 to 3. As I say, they're reverse scored so that there's some consistency in adding them all up. So if you end up scoring 0 or close to 0, then you're likely an extremely kind and empathetic person. The higher your score, the more you suffer from antisocial tendencies, or perhaps in the extreme, you may suffer from ASPD. And by the way, if you're worried about someone in your life, you can again have them complete the 16-item questionnaire, or you can, as I say, complete that on behalf of them. Just substitute their name in the statements and identify whether you agree or disagree with each statement as they apply to that individual. So that's one way of getting at the issue. But then what about the broader civic or community or even national level? Are we still a kind and generous people? Do we tend to be genuinely concerned about our neighbors and our fellow human beings? I have to confess, I'm a bit worried these days. The forces seem to be threatening our social cohesion, our social contract with one another. There seem to be forces that are sort of pushing us away from each other at the collective or tribal level, or making us retreat very narrowly into our own very specific tribes. And maybe it's always been thus. But aren't there common aspects of human behavior that make nearly all of us uncomfortable, or that we find deeply troubling or upsetting? By any standard of normalcy, we can almost certainly agree that individuals who kill or rape innocent people, or who torture or victimize children, they've committed some of the worst atrocities imaginable. And obviously, we want these people to be brought to justice. I wouldn't wish such horrible things on anyone, even someone that I don't really like at all. I'd never want to see them suffer. And at the same time, assuming we're not sociopaths, we should all feel for those who have suffered, certainly for those who have lost loved ones, those who have suffered random acts of violence, those who have lost their lives in conflict. Whatever the case may be, no one wants to suffer, and no one wants to, for example, have to bury one's own child. I can't imagine the pain that a parent must feel. But millions of parents have felt that kind of pain. So is it not the case then that we universally condemn intentional acts of violence, rape, and torture of innocent people? And at what point would you not recoil at cruelty? Now, speaking for myself, again, I've always recoiled at cruelty and the suffering that others have endured. I have a visceral reaction when I see somebody deeply hurting or in pain, even if I don't know the person, even if I don't necessarily like the person. Have I hurt others at times in my life? Absolutely. Have I caused pain in others? Yes, of course. But I can also tell you that when that's happened, I immediately start to feel a sense of remorse or regret. So for me personally, the worst feeling in the world is knowing that I'm somehow responsible for actually harming someone else, especially in the context of me getting angry or just doing something stupid. So I wish I could say that I've lived a life where I've never deeply hurt another person, either physically or emotionally. But alas, I cannot. On the bright side, I don't think I've actually genuinely or deeply hurt or harmed someone in a very, very long time. And maybe you haven't either. But there's another level that I worry about as well. What about our collective sentiments? Do we support or condone others who justify harming people or being cruel toward others? Do we support specific practices or policies that inflict real harm upon others? Are we complicit in some senses? Just in general, have we narrowed the boundaries and the limits of our kindness and empathy toward our fellow human beings? So that's the challenge I put before us. Adam Serwer published an article, "The Cruelty is the Point." I'll leave a link below, where he wrote the following. And by the way, spoiler alert, if you're a huge fan of the current U.S. president, you might find some of Serwer's comments a bit unsettling. But ask yourself honestly, if you listen, where do you stand? So Serwer writes, President Trump and his supporters find community by rejoicing in the suffering of those they hate and fear. The Trump era is such a whirlwind of cruelty that it can be hard to keep track. This week alone, the news broke that the Trump administration was seeking to ethnically cleanse more than 193,000 American children of immigrants whose temporary protected status had been revoked by the administration. That the Department of Homeland Security had lied about creating a database of children that would make it possible to unite them with their families that the administration had arbitrarily destroyed. And that the White House was considering a blanket ban on visas for Chinese students, and that it would deny visas to same-sex partners of foreign officials, and so on. I'm going to end the quote there, because the piece continues along this vein to identify several additional actions taken by the Trump administration. And yet here's the thing. Serwer published the article back on October 3rd, 2018, during Trump's first administration. And he eventually turned that article into a full-blown book with the same title, The Cruelty is the Point. So is that the case? Is that still the point? Well, another writer, Jeremi Suri, S-U-R-I, has penned a more recent article about cruelty and kindness, reflecting especially on the enduring legacy of the U.S. as being, for the most part, on the right side of history, or certainly during the Second World War. And he quoted from President Ronald Reagan's speech on the 40th anniversary of Normandy. Reagan spoke of how he admired the soldiers and the survivors that he addressed that day. Why? Because, Reagan argued, quote, there's a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. You were here to liberate, not to conquer, and so you and the others did not doubt your cause, and you were right not to doubt, end quote. In other words, whatever their failings, the Americans proved their goodness by joining their allies to defeat fascism and rebuild the war-torn societies. And at home, citizens pitched in just as well to improve the lives for everyone with federal programs like the GI Bill that sent more than 8 million veterans of all backgrounds to college or university, including my own father. And also helped more than 4 million veterans of all backgrounds buy their first homes. So every post-war politician, every major such politician, has appealed to the American promise when running for office. President George H.W. Bush captured the sentiment in his inaugural address when he said, "America is never wholly herself unless she is engaged in high moral principle. We as a people have such purpose today. It is to make kinder the face of the nation and gentler the face of the world." So Suri then asks, well, where has that kindness gone in 2025? And he writes, I still see it in the students who comfort their friends who are shocked that relatives will be deported from their schools and churches and homes. I still see it in the firefighters, rescuers, doctors, and nurses rushing to the fires in Los Angeles or the waters of the Potomac to save lives. And I still see it in my own neighbors who check in on one another and care for common spaces. We continue to show our kindness in many ways, but cruelty has become acceptable, often encouraged, and we have not seen in our recent past, end quote. So Suri then goes on to outline a number of examples, again from the current administration, to illustrate his arguments about how the U.S. seems to have changed. I get it. Some people, perhaps even millions of people, applaud the changes in the U.S. government. And there are certainly a great many areas where we could reach broad consensus, at least in principle, like eliminating obvious cases of fraud and abuse. And that's how we tend to approach our lives and society in general, right? In other words, think about it in terms of our own personal experiences. I mean, if we're the victims of fraud and abuse, we typically want two things. First, we want to stop being victimized or abused. Second, we want those responsible for knowingly taking advantage of us or for abusing us to be held accountable. And there's kind of a third one often that's unspoken that we might prefer then that we could take steps to ensure that we don't continue to be victimized in the future. But in the extreme, if someone acts with cruelty towards us or toward our loved ones, then we are going to rightly feel deeply hurt, and we might even want revenge. But we know, too, the adage that an eye for an eye ultimately just leaves us both blind. And so we temper that sense of anger and revenge with that in mind. Take it a step further. We know that if parents severely abuse their children, these same children then are going to be at greater risk for abusing their children and then continuing the cycle of abuse and violence within the family. And yet, if we were abused as children ourselves, don't most of us prefer not to abuse our own children? Wouldn't most people prefer to stop the cycle rather than continuing the abuse and blinding our own kids, metaphorically, if not literally? So, if we don't want that in our personal lives, surely we don't want that either in the people that we elect or our government. We don't want them to act with cruelty, correct? Now, we can disagree about policies, obviously, like whether the tax rate should be 10% or 20% or 30% or higher or lower. Right? Or we could disagree about whether we should increase or decrease funding for public education or for the arts or for fixing potholes. But do we really think that our government officials should advocate revenge or act with cruelty towards specific groups? Well, you might suggest, well, yes, of course, if that's necessary to protect us, or if the people that they're acting on have done something terribly wrong. All right, that may be true. There may be government responsibilities, obviously. That's why we have police forces and defense forces and so forth. And sometimes we have to lock people up because they're a danger to themselves, but more often because they're a danger to the rest of us. But of course, we have an obligation to establish that they've done something wrong if we're going to take those measures. That's the first criterion in any sane, democratic society. Any society that prides itself on touting justice. None of us wants to be falsely accused or imprisoned, or even worse, if we've objectively done nothing wrong. Now, let's say, however, that we have done something wrong. I'll use myself as an example. When we were kids, you know what we'd sometimes do in wintertime? Maybe you did as well. Hope not. And this is true, though. We'd throw snowballs at cars as they were driving by, and then we'd typically run away so we wouldn't get caught. And in fact, I don't think I ever recall getting caught by someone for throwing a snowball. And if I had gotten caught, I probably would have gotten into serious trouble, at the very least with my parents, if not with the law proper. I certainly could have been charged in principle with, mischief or found guilty of, maybe something more serious. But guess what happened? Just 3 months ago, January 22nd, 2025, in Hartford, Connecticut. A boy was shot multiple times after he reportedly threw a snowball at a car. Law enforcement responded after receiving a report of the child being shot, and upon arriving at the scene, officers found a 12-year-old boy suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. Authorities learned that the boy and an 11-year-old friend of his were playing in the snow and started throwing snowballs at cars. But one of the vehicles that was struck then circled back around and chased the children before someone inside the vehicle opened fire. The boy was taken to hospital, thankfully, with non-threatening injuries. But nonetheless, does anyone condone the shooting of the boy? Even though he clearly done something wrong, right? I would think not. For most of us, that would be cruel and unusual punishment. And so the police investigated the scene and the situation, and they've been trying to identify who the shooter was. I don't know what's happened since then, or if they've been able to round up whoever was involved. Or consider the case of 3 teens who were recently caught on camera and appeared to be throwing rocks at passing cars in part of the Israeli-occupied West Bank. The Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, opened fire on the teens, one of whom was killed. The deceased was a 14-year-old Palestinian American, Amir Mohammed Rabi, originally from New Jersey. The 2 other teenage boys, one's family told the CBS News that he was also a U.S. citizen. They were also shot, but they survived. One had a little more serious injuries, but the other was just grazed. But they should both be fine. So Rabi's father told CBS News just this past Monday that his son's siblings live in the United States, but that Amir and his parents were living in Tunis Aya, where the teen was attending school. The Israeli Defense Forces said in a statement that IDF soldiers had, quote, identified 3 terrorists who hurled rocks toward the highway, thus endangering civilians driving. The soldiers opened fire towards the terrorists who were endangering civilians. eliminating one terrorist and hitting 2 additional terrorists. End quote. But once more, doesn't the same logic apply? Yes, it's clearly wrong to throw rocks or snowballs at passing cars. But terrorists? And is capital punishment, the killing of the teen, the proper response to teens throwing objects at cars? Is that not cruel and unusual punishment? Well, it seems to me that people everywhere need someone, anything, anyone to blame if things are not going right in their worlds. In my view, cruelty serves as an expression or a substitute for one's own resentment, and often as a mask of one's own insecurities and deep-seated pain. Bad things have happened to me, so someone's going to pay. That seems to be the logic here. Or I've grown to really resent this or that group of people who've hurt me and my people, and someone's going to pay. Or my leaders have told me about these people coming into our country and taking advantage of people, or doing illegal things, or hurting people in my community. So someone's going to pay. And if not that person directly, then anyone who looks like them, and so on. And there might be some kind of a zero-sum kind of thinking in people's advocating cruelty as well. I cannot be happy or successful or live in a perfect world where others are taking advantage of me, or taking away opportunities, or just don't look or sound like me and my family, my tribe. And some politicians then are particularly good at promulgating such divisive thinking and stoking people's fears. So what would I say then? If some folks cannot see the cruelty in certain policies or the widespread pain and suffering that real people are experiencing, then these people are trapped themselves in their own worlds of pain. If people allow themselves to be blinded by political rhetoric or party loyalties to rejoice in the pain inflicted upon others, then they are, knowingly or not, cultivating a culture of cruelty. If you find yourself nodding in agreement with those who would disparage whole groups as people who are unworthy vermin, or aliens, or pure animals, or the undeserving, then again, you too might be part of the problem. And if you find yourself justifying actions or policies towards these other groups that you wouldn't in a million years wish to happen to you or your own family, then you're probably, again, contributing to or helping to create a cruel society. So Suri concludes his article accordingly. There must come a point, though, where in the coming weeks and months, as the cruel policies of the administration create widespread pain and suffering, we must show our kind neighbors why these results are what they should really fear. Cruelty is not a solution to the fears motivating its spread. Experiencing how cruelty harms us will be a wake-up call. Seeing how cruelty turns our fears into nightmares will shake many people out of their sleep. Americans are still a kind people, susceptible to cruel impulses. Clear discussion about how that cruelty is harming us can reawaken kindness again. We must begin those discussions. Don't argue over ideology. Show your neighbors how ugly their cruelty is in practice. Help them see that kindness really is the better way. End quote. And I guess that's the point, and a fundamental choice that we have, starting at the individual level. We can choose to be cruel or to be kind. As for myself, I choose the latter. And I'll always strive to practice what I preach. That's also what I encourage in others, from the personal to the most powerful. It's not that people and public figures don't sometimes have to make tough choices. We all do. Sometimes programs must be cut. Sometimes students fail exams. Sometimes people don't meet the immigration requirements or have to be deported. Sometimes people can't afford the rents, or they lose their jobs, or they're let go from their jobs involuntarily, even though they've been loyal and hardworking. But my point is that whenever these things happen, and especially when these things happen, then we have an even greater obligation to be as kind and as gentle as possible, because people are suffering. As Lincoln concluded in his second inaugural address, just 41 days before he was assassinated, quote, final piece of his speech, some of you probably know this, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." End quote. Again, that's his plea for kindness and reconciliation in the aftermath of the U.S.'s most brutal and deadly war, the Civil War. And so I would conclude then, too, by saying, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, to choose kindness over cruelty, and offer hugs in abundance. Until next time, Dr. J out.